April 1970. It had been less than a year since Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. 9 months. That was all it took for the human race to get bored with the impossible. Apollo 11 was a global earthquake. It stopped wars. It emptied streets. Apollo 12 was a sequel. Successful, precise, but less exciting. By the time Apollo 13 rolled out to the pad, the American public had tuned out. The networks weren't even planning to carry the prime-time broadcasts. The Vietnam War was raging. The Beatles were breaking up. Inflation was rising. People looked at the Saturn V rocket, a 36-story skyscraper filled with 6 million pounds of explosive fuel, and they didn't see a miracle. They saw a bus schedule. Another moonshot? Okay. Let us know when they get back. But inside the astronaut corps, there was no boredom. There was a quiet, creeping dread. They knew the statistics. They knew that every successful launch was a roll of the dice. They knew that the hardware was aging, the budgets were being cut, the margins of safety were getting thinner. And they knew about the number 13, scheduled to launch at 13:13 military time, entering the moon's gravity on April 13th. The scientists and engineers at NASA prided themselves on being men of logic. They didn't believe in superstition, but the sailors, and all astronauts are sailors at heart, felt the prickle on the back of their necks. They wondered if NASA was tempting fate. This is not just a story about a broken tank. This is a story about hubris. It is a story about what happens when we mistake luck for competence. And it is the story of 3 men who were sent to the moon in a machine that was dying before it even left the ground. To understand the tragedy, you have to understand the captain. James Lovell. At 42 years old, Jim Lovell was the most traveled man in history. He had flown on Gemini 7, 14 days in a tin can, the size of a front seat of a Volkswagen. He had flown on Gemini 12. He had flown on Apollo 8, the first mission to ever leave Earth orbit and circle the moon. He had seen the moon up close. He had navigated across the dark side, but he had never touched it. Apollo 13 was his swan song. He told his wife, Marilyn, that this was it, the last ride. He wanted those footprints. He wanted to land in the Fra Mauro Highlands, a rugged, hilly terrain that scared the geologists. Lovell was the anchor. He wasn't a hotshot test pilot like Yeager. He was a steady hand. He was the kind of man whose pulse actually slowed down when the alarms went off. He was an optimist. He believed in the system, but his crew was complicated. Originally, he was supposed to fly with Fred Hayes and Ken Mattingly. Fred Hayes was the Lunar Module pilot, a rookie, a grin with legs. He was sharp, eager, and physically tough. He was going to walk on the moon with Lovell. Ken Mattingly was the Command Module pilot. Mattingly was a different breed. Intense, bald, serious. He was a bachelor. He had no wife, no kids, no hobbies. The Command Module was his family. He knew every switch, every circuit breaker, every line of code in the computer. He was the best pilot in the program. They had trained for 6 months. They were a single organism, Lovell, Hayes, Mattingly. They moved together. They thought together. And then, 7 days before the launch, biology intervened. It started with a backup pilot, Charlie Duke. Charlie Duke had spent the weekend with a friend's family. He played with a little girl named Paulina. 2 days later, Paulina had spots, German measles, rubella. It's a childhood disease, annoying but harmless. Unless you're locked in a pressurized capsule with 100% oxygen for 2 weeks, then it can be fatal. The NASA doctors panicked. They tested the crew. Charlie Duke had it. He was out. Jim Lovell, immune. He had kids. He'd had it years ago. Fred Hayes, immune. Ken Mattingly? The doctors checked his blood. No antibodies. He had never had the measles. and he had been sitting next to Charlie Duke for weeks. The flight surgeon made the call. Mattingly is a time bomb. If he breaks out in a fever while he's alone in the command module orbiting the moon, he could die. Or worse, he could become incapacitated and unable to dock with the lander. He could strand Lovell and Hayes on the surface forever. They grounded him. 2 days before launch, Jim Lovell fought like a tiger. "I'll take the risk," he said. "Ken is my pilot. We've trained for this. You can't break up the team now." NASA management held firm. "No, either you take the backup pilot or we bump your entire crew to the next mission." Lovell had a choice: give up his last chance at the moon or betray his friend. He chose the moon. Ken Mattingly watched his rocket from the sidelines. He never got the measles, not a single spot. It was the cruelest irony of his life. He was grounded for a phantom illness. He drove his Corvette out to the launch pad, watched the bird he was supposed to fly, and felt his heart break. But his replacement was waiting. Enter Jack Swigert. If Mattingly was a monk, Swigert was a rock star. He was 38, a bachelor, a ladies' man. He had a girl in every port. He was known for forgetting his tax returns and asking for extra per diem. He was charming, loose, and a little bit chaotic. But he was also a brilliant pilot. He was the author of the Command Module Malfunction Procedures. He literally wrote the book on what to do when things broke. But fitting Jack Swigert into the Lovell-Hayes dynamic was like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. They had 48 hours to gel. They ran simulations. Swigert was rusty. He made mistakes. In the simulator, he forgot to jettison the launch escape tower during an abort. "You just killed us, Jack," the instructor said. Lovell was worried. Hayes was skeptical. But they had no choice. Swigert was part of the family now. This dynamic is crucial. When the accident happens, Swigert is the outsider. He is the one who feels he has something to prove. He is the one terrified that he caused the explosion. April 11th, 1970. The Saturn V is a beast. It stands 363 feet tall. When the 5 F1 engines ignite, they generate 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The sound is so loud it can melt concrete. The sound waves alone can kill a man if he stands too close. It consumes 15 tons of fuel per second. Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert lay on their backs in the capsule Odyssey. They felt the beast wake up. The vibration is not a shake, it is a collision. It feels like a train wreck that lasts for minutes. "Liftoff, we have a liftoff." They cleared the tower. They were pinned to their seats by 4 Gs. But then, something happened that almost ended the mission right there. 2 minutes into the flight, the center engine of the second stage, the inboard engine, shut down early. It wasn't supposed to do that. The computer detected a massive vibration, pogo oscillation. The rocket was shaking itself to death like a wet dog. The computer killed the engine to save the ship. In Houston, the flight controllers froze. Gene Kranz, the flight director in the white vest, looked at his screens. Is she going to make orbit? They did the math in seconds. The other 4 engines had to burn longer to compensate. They burned an extra 34 seconds. It was close. They barely had enough fuel. But they made it. They were in orbit. The astronauts wiped the sweat from their eyes. "Well," Lovell joked, "we had a little glitch there." They didn't know it was a warning. The gremlins were already in the system. The trip to the moon takes 3 days. Once they performed the trans-lunar injection, the burn that slingshots them out of Earth's orbit, the violence stopped. Now, it was quiet. The spacecraft was a marvel. It consisted of 2 parts joined together. The Command Service Module, CSM, named Odyssey. This was the mothership. It had the heat shield, the main engine, and the life support. Attached to its nose was the Lunar Module, LM, named Aquarius. This was the spider-like lander. For the first 2 days, the trip was boring, and that's exactly what NASA wanted, a milk run. Jack Swigert was getting comfortable. He realized he had forgotten to file his federal income taxes. He radioed Houston. "Hey, how do I get an extension? I'm, currently out of the country." Houston laughed. The press laughed. It was a light-hearted moment. Lovell played music, Aquarius by the Fifth Dimension. Fred Hayes played Tourist. He took the TV camera and filmed the inside of the ship. On the evening of April 13th, 55 hours into the mission, they did a TV broadcast. They showed the world how they ate. They showed the zero-gravity tricks. Lovell held up a tape recorder. "For the people down there who think this is easy," he said, "it's tricky business." They signed off. This is the crew of Apollo 13, wishing everyone there a nice evening. Lovell turned off the camera. He looked at the window. Earth was a marble. The moon was getting bigger. They were 200,000 miles from home. In Houston, nobody watched the broadcast. Not a single network carried it. The flight controller came on the loop. "Okay, 13, we've got a few housekeeping items for you. Go ahead, Houston. We'd like you to stir up your cryo tanks." Let's pause. We need to understand the anatomy of the disaster. In the service module, the big cylinder behind the astronauts, there were 2 tanks of liquid oxygen. Oxygen in space is life. It is the air they breathe. It is the oxidizer for the rocket engine. But most importantly, it feeds the fuel cells. The fuel cells mix hydrogen and oxygen to create electricity and water. No oxygen means no power. No power means no computer, no heat, no radio, and no water. Inside oxygen tank number 2, there was a flaw. Years ago, the tank had been dropped at the factory, just 2 inches. A tiny accident. It was tested. It seemed fine. It was installed in Apollo 10, then removed, then installed in Apollo 13. But during a pre-launch test weeks ago, the heater inside the tank had been left on too long. The voltage was too high. The insulation on the wires inside the tank had melted. Nobody knew. It was a hidden bomb, sitting in the liquid oxygen, waiting for a spark. When Houston ordered the cryo-stir, Jack Swigert reached for the switch. Cryo-stir means turning on a fan inside the tank to mix the icy slush so the sensor reads accurately. Swigert flipped the switch. "Fan on," he said. Inside the tank, the fan spun. The bare wires touched. A spark. In an environment of 100% pure liquid oxygen, a spark is not a spark. It is a detonator. The oxygen turned into fire. The pressure spiked instantly. The tank didn't just leak. It exploded. It blew the side panel off the service module. It severed the pipes to tank number 1. It smashed the fuel cells. Jack Swigert felt the ship shudder. It sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a tin roof. Bong. Lovell was floating in the tunnel. He thought it was a joke. He thought Hayes had opened a valve too loud. But then the master alarm screamed. Swigert looked at the console. A constellation of red lights. He grabbed the microphone. He spoke the words that would define the mission. "Okay, Houston." Pause. "We've had a problem here." April 13th, 1970. 55 hours, 55 minutes into the mission. The explosion wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the confusion. In the movies, everyone knows instantly that the ship is dying. In reality, nobody knew anything. The telemetry on the screens in Houston was garbage. The numbers were jumping. One sensor said the pressure was 0. Another said it was normal. Cy Liebergott, the EECOM, Electrical, Environmental, and Consumables Manager, stared at his screen. He thought it was an instrumentation error. "It's a glitch," he told the flight director. "The sensors are lying." On board Odyssey, the crew was just as confused. Lovell floated to the window. He looked out. He saw something that made his blood freeze. A cloud. A white, misty cloud surrounding the ship, sparkling in the sunlight. It wasn't gas. It was ice. It was their oxygen venting into space. "Houston," Lovell said, his voice flat. "We are venting something out into the void." That was the moment the reality shifted. It wasn't a sensor error. It was a physical breach. They were bleeding to death. The math was brutal. Tank 2 was gone, exploded. Tank 1 was dying. The pipe was cut. Fuel cell 1 and 3 were dead. Fuel cell 2 was fading fast. Without fuel cells, the Command Module Odyssey had only its re-entry batteries. Those batteries were small. They were meant for the final hour of the mission, not for 3 days. Once those batteries died, the ship would become a tomb. No air scrubbers, no heat, no guidance computer. Gene Kranz, the flight director with the flat-top haircut and the white vest, stood up in mission control. "Let's look at this thing from a standpoint of status. What have we got on the spacecraft that's good?" The answer was nothing. The mothership was dead. There was only one option: the Lunar Module Aquarius. The LM was designed to land 2 men on the moon and support them for 2 days. It was not designed to support 3 men for 4 days. It had no heat shield. It couldn't re-enter Earth's atmosphere, but it had oxygen, it had water, it had batteries, and it had an engine. They had to move, fast. The command module was dying. The oxygen pressure was dropping so low that the last fuel cell was about to quit. When it quit, the lights would go out. Lovell and Hayes scrambled into the tunnel. They floated into Aquarius. It was cold. It was dark. They had to bring the systems online. This usually takes 3 hours. They had 15 minutes. Swigert stayed behind in Odyssey. He had to shut it down. This was heartbreaking for a pilot. You never turn off your ship in space. If you turn it off, the fluids freeze. The gyros stop. The computer loses its memory. You might never get it back on. But he had no choice. Swigert flipped the switches. One by one, the lights on his console died. The hum of the fans stopped. The command module went silent. It was now just a heavy, dead weight attached to the nose of the lunar module. Swigert floated through the tunnel and joined the others in Aquarius. 3 men in a phone booth. They were alive, but they were still heading away from Earth at 2,000 miles per hour toward the moon. Now, the navigation problem. Before the explosion, Apollo 13 had performed a maneuver to leave the free return trajectory. Basically, they were aiming for the Fra Mauro Highlands, not the center of the moon. If they did nothing, they would miss the moon, swing past it, and miss the Earth on the way back. They would drift into deep space forever. To get home, they had to push themselves back onto the free return path. They had to use the LM's descent engine. This engine was designed to lower the lander gently onto the moon. It was not designed to push the massive, dead bulk of the command module. Would the connection tunnel snap? Would the center of gravity be off? They had to burn the engine, but they couldn't use the computer. The computer used too much power. They had to do it manually. Lovell took the hand controller. Hayes watched the clock. Swigert watched the angles. Burn. The engine fired. The stack shuddered. For 30 seconds they held their breath. The engine held. The tunnel held. They were back on track. They would swing around the moon and gravity would throw them back toward Earth. But there was a catch. The return trip would take 4 days. They didn't have consumables for 4 days. They would run out of water and power about 10 hours before they hit Earth. April 14th, 7:30 p.m. Apollo 13 disappeared behind the moon. This is the moment of maximum isolation. Radio signals are blocked by the moon's mass. Silence. For 20 minutes, They were the loneliest humans who ever lived. They looked out the window. They were 150 miles above the lunar surface. The landscape they had trained to walk on was right there. Tsiolkovsky Crater, the Sea of Moscow. It was gray, dead, and beautiful. Hayes and Swigert grabbed cameras. They were tourists again. Look at that, that's Fra Mauro. But Lovell didn't look. He was the commander. He knew that the moon was no longer the destination. It was the tombstone. "Gentlemen," Lovell said, "we're not here to take pictures. We're here to burn." As they rounded the far side, they saw the Earth rise. A tiny, blue and white marble in the black void. It looked fragile. It looked very, very far away. Lovell looked at his thumb. He could cover the entire Earth with his thumb. All of history, everyone he loved, behind his thumb. They reacquired the signal with Houston. "Houston, we are reading you." Now came the second big burn, the PC+2 burn, Pericynthion plus 2 hours. They needed to speed up. If they just coasted, they would land in the Indian Ocean, where there were no recovery ships. They needed to land in the Pacific. To do that, they had to fire the engine again, hard, 5 minutes of thrust. This burn was the most critical moment of the flight. If they burned too long, they would burn up in Earth's atmosphere. If they burned too short, they would skip off the atmosphere like a stone on a pond. They nailed it. The splashdown time was cut by 10 hours. Now they had a chance. The consumables might last. Now began the long wait. The trip home. To save power, they turned off everything. The heater, the guidance system, the radar. The temperature inside Aquarius dropped. 50 degrees, 40 degrees, 38 degrees. It was a damp cold. Because they weren't running the electronics, the water separators weren't working. Humidity built up. Water condensed on the walls. It pooled on the floor. It coated the windows in ice. The astronauts were soaked. Their breath came out in clouds. They put on their extra underwear. They floated in the dark, shivering. They couldn't sleep. The cold was too intense. They huddled together for warmth, but in zero gravity, heat doesn't rise. It just radiates away. Fred Hayes began to get sick. The stress and the cold weakened his immune system. He developed a kidney infection. He was burning with fever, shaking with chills, in a freezing spaceship. Lovell hugged him to share body warmth. "Hang in there, Fredo," Lovell whispered. Swigert was miserable. He was the command module pilot. He didn't know the LM systems well. He felt useless. He retreated into the docking tunnel, the warmest part of the ship, and tried to rest. Then came the carbon dioxide. Humans exhale CO2. In a small space, CO2 is deadly. It makes you sleepy, then confused, then dead. The lunar module had lithium hydroxide canisters to scrub the air, but the LM was designed for 2 men for 2 days. There were 3 men for 4 days. The canisters were saturated. The CO2 light came on. They had plenty of fresh canisters in the command module. But there was a problem. The command module canisters were square. The lunar module receptacles were round. It was the ultimate engineering oversight. Different contractors built the 2 ships, and they didn't standardize the parts. Square peg in a round hole. Literally. In Houston, the engineers went to work. They gathered everything the astronauts had on board: duct tape, flight manuals, plastic covers, socks, hoses, bungee cords. "We have to build an adapter," the lead engineer said. "We have to make this fit into this, using only this." They built a contraption on a table in the back room. It looked ridiculous. A cardboard box taped to a hose. They called it the mailbox. They radioed the instructions to the crew. "Okay, 13. Take a flight plan cover, roll it into a tube." Jack Swigert and Jim Lovell followed the instructions step by step. They tore the plastic covers off their checklists. They used rolls of gray duct tape. They installed the mailbox. They turned on the fan. The air hissed. The CO2 reading dropped. 0.8, 0.4, 0.1. The astronauts cheered. A muted, tired cheer. They weren't going to suffocate. Now they just had to avoid freezing or burning up. Back in Houston, Ken Mattingly, the man left behind, was working harder than anyone. He was in the simulator. His job was to figure out how to wake up the dead command module. Usually, the wake-up procedure takes hours and draws a lot of power. Swigert only had the re-entry batteries, a tiny amount of juice. Mattingly tried every sequence. If I turn on the telemetry first, the battery dies. If I turn on the heaters, the battery dies. He had to find the golden sequence, the perfect order of switches that would get the computer and the parachute system online without draining the battery dry. He worked for 24 hours straight. He lived on coffee and cigarettes. He was in a dark simulator, cold and tired, just like his friends in space. He was flying the mission with them. Finally, he found it. A weird, backward startup sequence. It required using the LM's battery to jumpstart the CM's main bus, essentially trickling power backward through the wires. It had never been done before. It was risky, but it was the only way. Mattingly walked into mission control with a stack of paper. "I've got the procedure," he said. "It works." April 16th, approaching Earth. The navigation was drifting again. The cold had affected the thrusters. The venting gas from the explosion acted like a tiny rocket, pushing them off course. They were coming in too shallow. If they didn't correct it, they would bounce off the atmosphere. They had to do another burn. But this time, they had no computer at all. The guidance platform was off to save power. They had to fly the spaceship like a World War I biplane. By sight. Lovell had to look out the window. He had to find the Terminator line on Earth, the line between day and night. He had to align a crosshair on the window with that line. "Keep the Earth in the window," Houston said. "It sounds easy. It is terrifyingly hard." The ship was drifting. Lovell controlled the pitch. Hayes controlled the roll. Swigert timed it. "Burning." Lovell wrestled the stick. The heavy stack wanted to wobble. "Steady. Steady." He steered a 20-ton spaceship using the Earth as a sight. 14 seconds. "Shut down." They checked the tracking. Perfect. Jim Lovell, the old sailor, had navigated them home by looking out the window. April 17th. 4 hours to entry. It was time to say goodbye. First, the service module. The broken engine room. They fired the explosive bolts. The cylinder drifted away. Lovell moved to the window. For the first time, they saw the damage. "My God," Lovell whispered. The side of the ship wasn't just dented. It was missing. A panel the size of a garage door was gone. The innards of the ship, tanks, pipes, wires, were hanging out like gutted intestines. It was a miracle the ship hadn't blown apart completely. Houston saw the photos later. They were stunned. "We were lucky," Kranz said. "We were incredibly lucky." Now, the Lunar Module Aquarius, the lifeboat. It had saved them. It had kept them warm, barely. It had given them air, but it couldn't come home. Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert transferred back into the Command Module Odyssey. It was freezing inside. Water was dripping from the control panels. They powered it up using Mattingly's sequence. The lights flickered. The computer hummed. It worked. They closed the hatch. They jettisoned Aquarius. As the faithful little lander drifted away to burn up in the atmosphere, Mission Control was emotional. "Farewell, Aquarius," the Capcom said, "and we thank you." Now it was just the three men. In a cold, wet comb, falling toward Earth at 25,000 miles per hour. Would the heat shield hold? Had the explosion cracked it? If there was even a hairline crack, the plasma of re-entry at 5,000 degrees would melt the ship instantly. There was no way to check. They just had to write it down. April 17th, 1970. 11:53 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The Command Module Odyssey hit the top of the atmosphere. This is the most violent part of any spaceflight. The ship is traveling at Mach 32. It slams into the air wall. The friction turns the air into plasma. The temperature outside the window rises to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, the crew watched the ionization trail, a pink and purple glow that turned into a roaring orange inferno. But there was a new fear: condensation. The interior of Odyssey was a rainforest. Every wire, every switch, every circuit breaker was covered in water droplets. When the G-forces hit, pushing up to 6 Gs, that water would be squeezed into the electronics. Would it short out? Would the parachute mortars fire? Or would the pyrotechnics fail because they were wet? Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert watched the instrument panel. They waited for a spark, a pop, a fire. Nothing happened. NASA had waterproofed the panels better than anyone knew. The engineering held. But then came the silence. Ionization blackout. The plasma sheath around the capsule blocks all radio waves. Usually, it lasts 3 minutes. 3 minutes where Houston can't talk to the crew, and the crew can't talk to Earth. In mission control, the room was silent. Gene Kranz stood at his console. He was smoking a cigarette, back when you could smoke in the control room. He crushed it out. He lit another one. Marilyn Lovell, Jim's wife, sat in her living room, clutching a handkerchief. The world watched Walter Cronkite. 3 minutes passed. Silence. Apollo 13, Houston, standing by. Static. 3 minutes, 30 seconds. This was longer than normal. The entry angle might have been too shallow. The blackout lasts longer if the angle is shallow. Or the heat shield failed, and they are dead. 4 minutes. The fear in the room was palpable. The flight surgeons watched the telemetry screens. No heart rates, no data. 4 minutes, 20 seconds. Suddenly, a crackle on the radio. "Okay, Joe." It was Swigert. "We read you, Jack," the Capcom shouted. On the main screen, a camera on the recovery ship Iwo Jima picked up a visual. 3 parachutes. Beautiful orange and white parachutes blooming against the blue sky. The control room erupted. Engineers were crying. They were hugging. They were lighting cigars. It was a louder cheer than the moon landing, because the moon landing was a triumph of technology. Apollo 13 was a triumph of the human spirit. The capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. It hit hard. The impact knocked the camera loose inside the ship. It hit Fred Hayes in the forehead. Even at the very end, the mission had one last punch for them. They bobbed in the water. Lovell opened the vent. Fresh, warm, salty air rushed in. It was the sweetest smell in the world. The Navy frogmen arrived. They opened the hatch. They saw 3 men with heavy beards, sunken eyes, and exhausted smiles. Fred Hayes was shivering with fever. Jim Lovell looked 10 years older. They were hoisted into the helicopter. As they flew toward the Iwo Jima, Jim Lovell looked down at the ocean. He hadn't walked on the moon. He had failed his mission. But he had brought his men home. Why did they survive? It wasn't luck. It was the Tiger team, the engineers in the back rooms, the men who built the adapter out of socks and tape, the men who calculated the burn angles by hand, Ken Mattingly in the simulator, Gene Kranz's leadership. But it was also the hardware. The Lunar Module, built by Grumman, performed 400% beyond its design specs. It was a lifeboat that never sprang a leak. The Command Module, built by North American Rockwell, woke up from the dead after being frozen for 3 days. It was the ultimate stress test of American engineering, and it passed. The investigation was swift. Why did the tank explode? It was a voltage mismatch. The heaters in the tank were designed for 28 volts, the ship's power. But at the launch pad, they used 65 volts, ground power, to test them. The higher voltage melted the insulation on the wires. It was a simple, stupid clerical error. A paperwork mistake that almost killed 3 men. NASA redesigned the oxygen tanks. They added a third tank. They removed the stirring fans. They moved the wiring away from the oxygen. Apollo 14, 15, 16, and 17 flew without incident. Jack Swigert, he never flew in space again. He left NASA. He entered politics. In 1982, he was elected to Congress in Colorado. But tragically, before he could be sworn in, he died of bone cancer. He was only 51. The man who survived the explosion couldn't survive the disease. Fred Hayes. He recovered from his kidney infection. He was scheduled to command Apollo 19. He was going to get his moonwalk. But Apollo 18 and 19 were canceled due to budget cuts. He flew the Space Shuttle Enterprise tests, but he never went back to space. Ken Mattingly, the man who was grounded, he eventually got his ride. He flew as Command Module pilot on Apollo 16. He flew into deep space. He did a spacewalk. Later, he commanded 2 space shuttle missions. He proved that the measles grounded him, but it didn't stop him. Jim Lovell, the captain. He retired from NASA and the Navy. He went into business. He never got his moonwalk, but he is remembered as one of the greatest commanders in history. Not because he planted a flag, but because he kept his head when the world was falling apart. Why does Apollo 13 matter today? We live in an age of complex systems. The internet, the power grid, AI. Apollo 13 teaches us that systems fail. Complexity breeds fragility. But it also teaches us that humans are the ultimate backup system. When the computer died, Lovell used the window. When the air scrubbers failed, the engineers used duct tape. It is the definitive story of work the problem. Gene Kranz's mantra, let's not make things worse by guessing. In the end, Apollo 13 was categorized as a successful failure. It failed to reach the moon. But in saving the crew, NASA proved something more important than rocketry. They proved that when we are stripped of our technology, when the lights go out and the cold sets in, we are still capable of greatness. Jim Lovell wrote in his book, "I look back on Apollo 13 not as a tragedy, but as a triumph. We didn't land on the moon, but we made it home." And sometimes coming home is the hardest mission of all.